Hi everyone, my name is Fatima and I am from Folio Books. Today we are gathered here for a live webinar to discuss Dr. Sher Ali's book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity. Dr. Sher Ali is an associate professor of religious studies at the Franklin and Marshall College. He's the co-editor of Imagining the Public in Modern South Asia. His work centers on Muslim intellectual thought in modern South Asia with a focus on intra-Muslim debates and polemics on crucial questions of law, ethics, and theology. His latest book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, has also won the prestigious American Institute of Pakistan Studies 2020 Book Prize. We also have two guest speakers with us today. We have Seher Shah with us. She teaches courses on Islamic art and culture at IBA in Karachi. She has completed a master's in Islamic studies at the George Washington University, specializing in the history of traditional calligraphy in the 20th century Pakistan. She has researched the development of Nastaliq script, the script most commonly used to write Urdu and classical Persian. In her research, she has focused on the lives and contributions of the master calligraphers of Lahore and Karachi. Seher is also a calligrapher in training. We also have Dr. Sajjad Rizvi with us today, who is a professor of Islamic intellectual history at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. He works primarily on the course of philosophical traditions in the Safavid Mughal period and is currently collaborating with colleagues on a monograph on philosophy in contemporary Iran. His approach to Islamic thought is marked by a decolonial desire to locate it within a more global and connected context free of Eurocentric assumptions. Thank you. Over to you, Seher.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much. The organizers, thank you for inviting me. Dr. Sher Ali, it's a real pleasure to share this space with you and to discuss your work. So without further ado, just to get right into it, Sher Ali, in order to set up a backdrop to your book, let us look at the political situation in India in the 19th century. We all know that this was a time of change of leadership and definitely a time of crisis for Indian Muslims. However, could you discuss with us some of the finer points of identity, authority, sovereignty that the Indian Muslim community was preoccupied with at this time?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much, Seher. I just want to begin by really registering my profound gratitude to both you, Seher, and to Sajjad for, on rather quick notice, doing this. I'm really honored, and this is really an act of tremendous intellectual generosity. So I'm very, very thankful for the gift of your time. And the second thing I must say is that thank you to Fatima for organizing this event, for all the time that she's put in this. And I really, really want to thank Folio Books for making this book available around 3.5 years after its original publication in 2020 to a Pakistani audience, which means a lot to me because that is one of the primary audiences of this book. And to have made it available not only in the bigger cities but all around the country is really, really a profound gift. And I want to register that and really want to both congratulate and also thank Folio for the outstanding work they're doing in making these academic books available to Pakistani audiences. So with that said, of course, I would love to hear more of your critiques and your reactions to the book as well, both you and Sajjad. But let me address the excellent question that you've asked. In some ways, this book, and this actually will give me a good opportunity to also not summarize, but talk about one key thread of the book for audience members who may not be familiar with the book itself. One of the key themes of this book is to think about how, as the Indian subcontinent, especially northern India, which is the main context of this book, increasingly comes under the juggernaut of colonial modernity. And as you have the increasing incrustation of modern colonial power in northern India, parallel to that historical development that happens from the late 18th century onwards for the entirety of the 19th century and goes through different phases and leads eventually in the post-1857 era in a almost in a much more complete political overhaul of northern India. with the onset of colonial modernity. Parallel to that, what kinds of traditions of intra-Muslim debate, contestation do we find among a certain segment of the North Indian Muslim scholarly elite whose thought, whose debates, still to this day in post-colonial South Asia and even beyond in diaspora communities around the world, the percolation of those debates are still to be seen. And one of the key ideas of this book, connected to that historical arc, is that I was curious about the idea, and a question that I would be often asked is, why did these kinds of debates, I know we'll get into the issues in a moment here, but these theological debates, legal debates on questions of divine sovereignty, on questions of proper ritual practices, to do with things like celebration of the Prophet's birthday, to what kind of knowledge does the Prophet have? Does he have knowledge of the unknown or not? All these kinds of questions, why did they become especially urgent and especially intensified in terms of their stakes for these scholars around the early to the later 19th century? And one of the key themes of this book is that as Northern India, especially colonial South Asia, comes more and more under the yoke of colonial power, these intra-Muslim debates that had existed for many centuries before this in South Asia, elsewhere as well, but how these intra-Muslim debates increasingly took on a group-centered orientation. And in some ways, the book tells us the historical narrative that it pivots on is how these debates, which were contested by individual Muslim scholars in the early 19th century, how did they take on a group-centered orientation with the category connected to this being maslak, which literally means a proper practice, proper ethical conduct, but in the South Asian context really means a competitive religious group or a competitive reform movement. And two of the most important or most influential, rather, groups that emerged or masalik that emerged in the late 19th century, the Deobandis and the Barelvīs, how can we theorize and conceptualize their debate and polemic, and what are some of the earlier 19th century or even late 18th century precedents to that polemic? So to complete my answer, so in some ways, it is precisely at this moment where you have the loss of Muslim political sovereignty. How should we imagine sovereignty is a question which is much in flux. And the paradoxical point that one should emphasize here is that it is precisely at a moment of the loss of Muslim political sovereignty that we saw unprecedented intellectual fermentation on the question of what should Islam be like in these new conditions of moral precarity, in these new conditions of political loss. So how loss in some ways engines and provides an impetus for the fermentation and a catalyst for the further efflorescence of intra-Muslim debates and these traditions. I'll pause there.
Okay. So on the point of intra-Muslim debate, now, so within the Muslim group, we've developed these ways of looking at Islam, especially in South Asia, very tidy, quite convenient and exclusive lenses that we look through. And what we see is either the lax Sufism-infused Islam or the rigid Sharia-tied Islam. And in our understanding, it's been an either-or situation in many cases. You've called it the law Sufism binary. And these mutually exclusive categories have become quite deeply set in our consciousness. We often operate with the binary vision as an underlying assumption. But of course, you've gone and shaken it all up. So to accomplish this rupture, you've shed light on the lives and works of two prominent 19th century Indian Muslim scholars who just won't fit in either of these boxes. The two figures, we're told, were vehemently opposed to each other's perspectives, but they couldn't be tied down to opposite sides of the binary. So, Sher Ali, could you please tell us more about these scholars and what they stood for?
Thank you, sir. Excellent question again. Well, first of all, I should definitely clarify and, in fact, just add the addendum to your excellent question that, I'm not the first one who's talked about or critiqued this binary. It has been done even in this context, for that matter. Professor Barbara Metcalfe's book on the seminal book on Deoband that came out in 1982 did talk about this binary and did try to critique it. But this binary still, has stuck has seemed quite intractable, not only in terms of some scholarship that I do cite in the introduction that, relies on this kind of a framing of these debates, but especially in popular consciousness within South Asia, elsewhere, this notion that these intra-Muslim debates really are a version of what we might call a debate between the good Muslims and the bad Muslims, where good Islam and good Muslims corresponds to a modern notion of what is good religion, which oftentimes corresponds to a certain strand of Protestant Christianity, which is, seen as a form of religion which is not too serious, which is not too, invested in questions of practice or boundaries of normativity. And that has been the kind of framing which has oftentimes been applied, or this is how it's popularly imagined, this intra-Muslim debate between these two groups. Now, the central problem with this binary, and a very obvious one, just by looking at the facts without even much analysis, is that, in fact, these two groups of scholars, the pioneers of the Deoband school and the Barelvī school, are both movements which emerged in the late 19th century in the post-1857 context, where Indian Muslims had been, brutally defeated by the British in the 1857 War of Rebellion. In this context of the loss of political sovereignty, of the emergence of these two reformist movements in northern India, which continue to this day in South Asia and elsewhere as well. So the most obvious problem with this binary is that the pioneers of these two movements were in fact major legal scholars, or master jurists of the Hanafi legal school, and they were also major Sufi masters. The founder of the Barelvī school, Ahmad Raza Khan, died 1921 from the Qadri order, and the pioneers of Deoband from the Chishti Sabri silsila or order. Moving beyond the facts, when you look at the internal logics of these debates, and that is the crux of the main argument that I present in this book. So, fine, we have questioned this binary. So, what is an alternative? What is an alternate conceptualization through which one can approach and one can look at this intra-Muslim debate? So, when one looks at the internal logics of these two groups of scholars, what I found quite interesting was, and that is in some ways a hypothesis that I then presented in this book, is that both of these scholars this set of scholars seem to be very invested in the question of how we might and how we should, in fact, imagine Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in conditions of colonial modernity. And for one group of scholars, the Deoband scholars and their predecessors before that, this person called Maulana Shah Muhammad Ismail, who was the grandson of the famous Shah Waliullah, died 1762. Shah Muhammad Ismail died in 1831. So the pioneers of Deoband school and their predecessors like Shah Muhammad Ismail, for them, in the new conditions of colonial modernity, it was imperative that South Asian Muslims, the people on the ground, do not associate qualities to the body of the Prophet that might undermine his humanity. And for them, the underlying reason for the kind of moral malaise or the moral sort of corruption that had taken hold of the conduct of South Asian Muslims at that time, so they have a narrative of this moral malaise and some kind of moral corruption and a moral emergency that they themselves then see as the reformers who will cleanse society of this moral corruption and malaise. The main reason for this is an absence or a lack of an active realization of the absoluteness of divine sovereignty. So it's really the undermining of divine sovereignty which gets manifested in the incrustation of different rituals on the ground, everyday practices, where it's not as if people have turned polytheistic or people have turned atheistic, but rather they have sort of lost sight of the primacy of divine sovereignty to the moral normative architecture of Islam. And one of the reasons for that is that they have undermined the humanity of the Prophet. So they propounded a moral framework and a religious framework, a normative framework, in which, in order to emphasize the absoluteness of divine sovereignty, you ought to emphasize the humanity of the Prophet. And through that, you would regulate the practices and ritual practices on the ground that would not elevate the Prophet, to an extent that it would be threatening to the absoluteness of divine sovereignty. And that, in some ways, the relationship that they then charted between God, Prophet, and community, theology, law, everyday practice, is a certain kind of what I call a political theology, the relationship between God, Prophet, and everyday practices on the ground. Now, in contrast to this, when you look at the other group of scholars, the Barelvī school, the founder is Ahmad Raza Khan, died 1921, and the predecessor to that is, in some ways, this very important school of philosophy and logic in South Asia, the Khairabadi school, and one of its main doyens, Fazl Haq Khairabadi, died 1762. In their thought, what we find is that you cannot, um, there is no way to emphasize divine sovereignty without first confirming the status of the prophet as the most beloved, as the most exceptional, as the most authoritative and charismatic creation of God. So, in other words, the absoluteness of divine sovereignty and the exceptional status of the prophet is not some kind of an opposite, is not some kind of a, it does not have an inverse relationship. In fact, it is precisely by establishing your love for the prophet as the most charismatic, as the most exemplary, being, that you affirm divine sovereignty. So, with that kind of a relationship between God and the prophet, they then defended practices like celebration of the prophet's birthday or other practices that exalted the prophet in the public sphere. So, here again, we have a competing relationship of the relationship between God, the prophet, and the community. Law, theology, everyday practice. So these two models, which I have sketched in very, very rudimentary terms, the details, of course, are in the book, is what I term competing political theologies of how to sum up the argument in the moment of a loss of political sovereignty, these intra-Muslim debates on theological sovereignty and its relationship to Prophet Muhammad's authority and the practice of everyday ritual life among the community, how this emerges at a particular historical moment in the history of South Asia, from the early to the later 19th century, and gives rise to this debate on the status of the Prophet in modernity. Hence, the book is called Defending Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Modernity.
If I can just take up two things from what you've said, and good morning and good evening to the two of you. On this issue of why a particular debate arises between Shah Ismail and Fazl Tarabadi in this early part of the 19th century, I mean, it strikes me that it comes within a broader political context, in which I would argue the sort of the Shah Waliullah tradition is presenting itself. So I think Deobandī Barelvī is a much later issue. So let's park that to a side for 1 second. And there's a different question about why do the Barelvīs and Deobandis take up this issue as something which defines and contests their political theology. The issue is why are Shah Ismail and Fazl Khalabadi having this particular kind of debate? And it seems that as I said, the Shah Waliullah school is trying to present itself as an upholder of a particular tradition, which is at the very least agnostic about British sovereignty and power in India, and at the most is entirely hostile too. And what it does is it criticizes popular practice as well as theological positions which it identifies as being of the camp of those who are pro-British. And I'll give you two examples of this. Before that, we know, for example, that from the 70s, 80s onwards, there wasn't much authority that the Mughals actually had in Delhi. And the authority that they did have was usually delegated. So you have the important period of Najaf Khan's basic rule of Delhi in that period. And because Najaf Khan came from this sort of Irani, sort of Shii context, there was quite a lot of attack on Shii ideas and Shii practices. So, the two examples are the famous kind of issue around Mirza Mazhar Jan-e-Janan, the famous Urdu poet. And the other one, of course, was Shah Abdul Aziz's Tuhfa Isna Sharia, which is an extremely significant text, which emerged in that period. And that's, I think, coming out of a certain anxiety about, the public sphere and what's happening with those who are perhaps not in line with a more traditional Mughal conception and perhaps not in line with, acquiescing to the encroachment of British rule. And of course, with Shah Ismail, it's much more explicit because he actually ends up, starting a movement which is, directly hostile to the British presence in North India. And of course, at the same time, Fazl Haq Khairabadi and his father are very much part of this old Delhi elite who have become part of the service, kind of the service notables who are working closely with the British. So I think that kind of context is actually quite important to say why this happens then, because both the anti-Shia polemics and the kind of issue of Imkan and Nazir and Ghalkiz, they're not new issues. We know that. But the reason why they emerge in that period in the early 19th century has to do with that political context, I think, which is quite significant. So, maybe if you could say something more about that. And then, my other question is, so why on earth do the Barelvis and Deobandis take this up? I mean, why does Fazl Haq Khairabadi become a Barelvi figure? There are clearly obvious differences between them on many issues. In fact, some of the great kind of Deobandi ulama probably have much more in line with the metaphysics of someone like Fazl Haq than most of the Barelvi figures are. And it kind of complicates the whole issue of Barelvi. I mean, even with Shah Ismail, not necessarily an obvious Deobandi forebear. If anything, he would be more of a forebear probably for the Ahl Hadith. And the Ahl Hadith are a different kind of. So in a sense, what I'm trying to ask in two different ways is something a bit more about the context of these two events, and then maybe opening up the situation. So, we're not just talking about Barelvis and Deobandis in the late 19th century. We're talking about Ahl Hadith. We're also talking about Ahl Quran a bit later. And we're certainly talking about the Ithna Ashari Shia.
No, thank you so much, Sajjad, for that really wonderful intervention and expanding the context, the intellectual and the political context beyond, in some ways, the specificities of this intra-Muslim debate. I think what your comment really shows, and the point I want to first emphasize and then come more to the specifics of what you've raised, is that these intellectual genealogies oftentimes are so complicated and are so intersecting that precisely this is the reason why one ought to be a bit careful about, easily categorized and easily pre-packaged or compartmentalized categories with which to view these actors, their thought, the progression of their thoughts, and so on. Let me add some brief notes to your wonderful comment. The first note I want to add is that the interesting thing here is that as much as this debate arises in the context of political flux and a moment in which the very status of sovereignty is under flux, and the whole question of how should one reorganize everyday ritual practices and one's conception of divine sovereignty, its relationship to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's authority, that in some ways it is someone like Shah Muhammad Ismail who, although belonging to the Shah Waliullah family, even has some very interesting differences and disagreements with members of his own family. So for example, there is this famous narrative that as opposed to his family, Shah Muhammad Ismail actually believed in Raf'ul Yadayn, or raising of the two hands during prayer, and some other questions as well on the whole question of the canonical authority of the Hanafi school. Shah Muhammad Ismail was not a complete non-conformist, but clearly a bit closer to what later became Ahl Hadith than his own Hanafi family. And so in some ways, Shah Muhammad Ismail has these positions which distinguish him not only from the Shah Waliullah family and his own grandfather and his uncle, Shah Abdul Aziz, but also from the later Deoband scholars. In fact, one of the interesting themes that came up after this book was published is that one of the critiques raised from within the traditional circles in South Asia, this really phenomenal scholar, Dr. and Maulana Waris Mazhari, raised the question that in fact there were some Deoband scholars like Maulana Anwar Shah Kashmiri later who were quite critical, deeply critical of Shah Muhammad Ismail as well, which really gives me the opportunity to make the point that there are specific issues and specific questions on which these scholars, like the pioneers of Deoband, Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, and so on, pick up on the legacy of Shah Muhammad Ismail. So they're quite selective in terms of things that they punctuate and things that they really pick up as part of the legacy that becomes, central to their debate and their polemic with Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvi school. The second interesting point I want to add to your comments is that despite the loss of Muslim political sovereignty being the immediate context, when you look at the debates and when you look at the discourses of someone like, let's say, Shah Muhammad Ismail, that in some ways it does align quite nicely with new notions of rationality. So he is very, very particular about the idea of not allowing the exception to the rule, or kharqul ada, to be associated with Prophet Muhammad. And that in some ways is central to, his critique of shafa'a, or prophetic intercession, his idea that, God does have the capacity to produce another Prophet Muhammad. If he wanted to, he will not, but he has that capacity. That capacity just never will enter into actuality, is the point that he makes. So on these kinds of issues of the critique of exception and the critique of hierarchical, notions of the relationship between God, community, saints, prophet, when it comes to questions like intercession. So he's very critical of those hierarchies, very critical of, allowing the exception to the prophet, very, very guarding of the exception remaining within the domain of divine sovereignty. That these kinds of notions, in fact, align quite nicely with a new emergent modern colonial episteme, which also in some ways is hostile to the exception. Now, further complicating this is that this is not the Shah Muhammad Ismail that you find in all of his texts. In some of his texts, which are geared more towards a more popular audience, like Energizing Faith or Taqwiyatul Iman, which was written in 1826, it is this kind of a shock and awe kind of a text, which is very critical of popular practices, very critical of any sign of the exception being given to the Prophet. But then if you move to his more Persian and more kind of a scholarly, or for a more scholarly audience, text called Mansab-e Imamat, or Station of Leadership, there he has not this kind of a maximalist position, but there he has a position that, you ought to show your allegiance to a Muslim scholar, even if he is morally depraved, unless the distinguishing markers of Islam are current in the public sphere, you show your allegiance to the Muslim leader of that time. A very different kind of Shah Muhammad Ismail than the one we find in Taqwiyatul Iman. So this is all to punctuate the point that, yes, you're absolutely correct that this is a larger context which is at work here. And this did not have to end up the way it ended up. I think that's one key point that I want to add to your comments, which is that in many ways, the formations of these groups, who they take as their intellectual predecessors, how does Fazl Kharabadi become part of this intra-Muslim debate later on, these are all contingent developments that did not have to pan out the way they panned out. And on some key issues, yes, there is a disjuncture between an Ahmad Raza Khan or a Fazl Kharabadi as well. So I don't want to make an argument for a neat teleological development of these intra-Muslim debates fought between individual Muslim scholars to have emerged then into these Muslim groups. But rather, I wanted to show a trajectory of an intra-Muslim debate that does take on the group-centered orientation, but is contingent, is not teleological in its development. Much more to be said, but I'll pause there.
Sorry, Seher, you were going to ask something before I butted in there. Please go ahead.
Not at all. If you have any follow-up, go ahead.
Not right now. Fine, go ahead.
Sher Ali, one question is sort of a broader question in your approach to dealing with some of these personalities and the material. Look, for the layperson, what you've allowed the reader to do is you've humanized these giants of theology. You've shared with us anecdotes about their lives. You've shared with us admissions of weakness. You've shared exchanges between brother and sister, testimonies from school teachers. Did you set out to do this? Did you set out to make them more accessible?
Thank you for that really good question. My use of narratives in this book really is in registering some kind of affinity with the discursive archive of this period and these schools. In other words, narrative biographies, or collections of narratives rather, is a very important part of this discursive archive. And even when you read the very serious texts on different kinds of questions, it is a kind of a discursive register which takes very seriously these reverential narratives through which the authority of these scholars is enshrined. Their polemics or their debates are also in terms played out through narrative when one school or one scholar wins out against another, etc. So there is famous narratives on both sides of the school where you have Ahmad Raza Khan showing up at the railway station to debate Ashraf Ali Thanvi, but Thanvi never shows up. On the other side, you have the same narrative when saying that Ahmad Raza Khan doesn't show up, etc. So narrative and narrative tellings are a very important part of the discursive, reservoir of this scholar. So I wanted to show the reader these aspects of the discourse. What ended up being that I think that it did provide, I think, for the reader some needed breaks from the rather technical and specialist debates that I was also trying to translate and elaborate and clarify for the reader in English. But those narratives are also very critical to some of the issues. Just one example, this whole question of widow remarriage, which became a very, very central theme for Shah Muhammad Ismail and the Mujahideen of the early 19th century that he was a part of, his millenarian master, Rai Barelvī, from, Sayyid Ahmad Barelvī, sorry. And his own sister had been a widow and had not remarried. And Shah Muhammad Ismail himself admits that when I used to teach my sister, the text of Mishkat al-Masabi, or this collection of hadith, I used to leave out the hadith on the virtues of remarriage so that this desire doesn't emerge in my elder sister. And in some ways, he admits that I had also absorbed this quote-unquote Hindu taboo. And he said, it's only when I met my master that this taboo eventually was erased, and I was able to then preach this message. There's a really dramatic story that he's giving a sermon on a given Friday, and he talks about this topic of widow remarriage, and someone raises his hand, and he realizes that this person will ask me about my own sister. So he rushes out of the mosque, goes to the sister's house, and says, "You must get remarried." She says, "I'm too old, I cannot get remarried." And he says, "No, you must." And then eventually she agrees, and he got him remarried to a friend of his, and then that's how the campaign really was launched. Interestingly, that exactly same story comes up in the biography of Maulana Qasim Nanotvi, one of the founders of the Deoband school, his biography Sawane Qasimi, written by Manazir Hasan Gailani, the exact same story. So in some ways, these stories also have a genealogy of sorts, these narratives, and they really do shape the kind of picture that we get of these individual scholars. Sajjad mentioned Mirza Mazhar Jane Jana, so it's very famous about him that he was very, very particular on questions of hygiene and questions of cleanliness, and was very nazuk mizaj, very meticulous about, or very sensitive about disorder. So there is a famous story that he went for dinner to someone's house, and that person really got the house sparkling clean, and in anticipation that Mirza Mazhar will be coming, and when they are about to start the dinner, Mirza Mazhar, puts his hand on his head and says, "I cannot eat here." And the host says, "Why?" And says, "I can see a little pebble under your carpet here. Unless you clean that and remove it, I won't be able to eat." So these are some interesting, narratives. Or just to end on Mirza Mazhar again, he was eventually shot, as we know, the famous story narrative that he had made, damning comments about a Muharram procession, and the news got to Najaf Khan, and a few days later, someone entered his house and shot him, and then he eventually passed away. But the story is that when the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam went to check in on him and asked him, "Mirza Mazhar Sahab, how are you doing?" He said, "I don't care much about the bullet that has entered my heart, because my heart was already quite wounded of all the pain and misery I've gone through. But the shots were fired from a very close distance, so the odor of the gunpowder is causing me a lot of disturbance." So these narratives, in some ways, do become part of the intellectual and persona of the scholars that I did want to communicate to the reader, that these are, as you mentioned, these are interesting, complicated people, and sarcasm is a very important part of the discursive arsenal as well. So that was the intention behind it, to show to the readers a fuller picture of who these people are behind these texts.
Absolutely. And so you were successful in that and made the book very enjoyable.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, back to me? Okay. Yes, in fact, just one small comment on that. We know from early periods in Islamic history that narratives are absolutely formative when it comes to school identity. So, the whole point of collective biographies of the great figures of the school in the past is precisely to make a cohesive sense of what that school is. So, and that still exists with a lot of the texts, certainly up to the time of Ashraf Ali Thanvi and beyond. If I can ask you perhaps a bit more, it's a bit more of a provocative question, which kind of arises from this. So if we bring things forward, in many ways, I think what you quite nicely present is why this contestation around the Prophet is so significant. So if we take it to the new context of Pakistan as a new nation state after 47. It seems that this contestation around the Prophet actually becomes the central issue when people are trying to make sense of what does it mean for this new state to be for Islam. I mean, leaving aside the whole question of Islamic republics and constitutions and so forth, but just the broader Islamic identity. It seems that it does very much come down to this question of the status of the Prophet. And of course, you see that partly on the side of the whole issue of, the kind of anti-Ahmadi agitations on Khatm al-Nabuwah, which of course is still a movement which still exists, and more broadly, and all sorts of issues around the authority of the Prophet, the blasphemy laws. Many of the blasphemy laws, in many ways, are tied around the Prophet and those who are around the Prophet. So, I mean, why is it we're still kind of at this point that this is the most sensitive and politically kind of charged issue, even 150 years after?
No, that's an excellent question. I would love to hear yours and Sarah's thoughts on this as well. I think you're absolutely right. The last note that you made, that in some ways this whole question of the status of the Prophet has become even more sensitive and intensified. And the paradox is that if you look at this 19th century debate, as fierce as it was, as intense as it was, at times as hostile as it was discursively and in terms of sarcasm, in terms of, it even resulted eventually in one scholar calling out the pioneers of the other school unbelievers. It led to anathema, takfir, as well, on the question of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown, ilmul ghaib. But for all those things aside, there is still a certain kind of an openness or a certain kind of space available intellectually to debate these questions fiercely, in depth. Some very controversial questions about, the knowledge of the Prophet in relation to that of Satan, and can you use these kinds of statements like Shah Muhammad Ismail did, that if God wanted in 1 second, in one moment he could create a million new Muhammads and so on, and that led to this whole debate on Imkan Nazir, can God produce another Prophet Muhammad or not? So as intense as these debates are and as controversial as they still are being fought out in the public sphere in some very specialist language, but also these do become part of the public sphere, and hence these debates continue to this time. There is space available for this kind of an open, intense debate. The interesting and paradoxical, or in some ways understandable also outcome, I think, if you compare it to the contemporary moment, is that although this question has become even more sensitive, the space to debate it has really shrunk. I'm quite sure that living today, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi would not have been able to write a text like Hifzul Iman, in which he talked about this whole idea of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown, or this question would not have been able to be debated with the kind of, openness that it was in the 19th century. So, in many ways, I think it does have to do with the question of this idea of where does the sovereignty of the self lie, becoming even more precarious, with this understanding that the modern state is not really a reflection of the popular will, the status of sovereignty becoming even more contested, even more fragile, in a state which itself, goes back and forth between a modernist mandate of erasing any kind of religious discord to then actively, supporting and actively abetting groups which actually would come into the public sphere and ignite these issues, as we have seen with the example of Tehreek-e-Labbaik Ya Rasulullah recently in Pakistan. So I think it's an unfortunate outcome, in fact. And I don't want to romanticize the 19th century or the past in any way as well. There are some very formidable scholars today who I'm sure, could and will and are debating these issues. The Barelvī-Deobandī polemic does continue in the Pakistani context with a lot of complexity as well, something that I've explored less, and other people, emerging scholars are writing on that. So I don't want to make this kind of a comparison between a ideal early 19th, 18th century and a only problematic present. But I do want to register that it is unfortunate that the space of these kinds of debates has shrunk. And a very philosophically, theologically rich set of questions, which you would know better than anyone, Sajjad, the space for that debate has almost evaporated. I think my reading is that it has further to do with disenchantment with the modern state, a further crisis of where sovereignty resides, and that in some ways has led to rather pathological inheritances of prophetic authority, and those anxieties in some ways get channeled into these discourses of blasphemy, etc., where the fragility of sovereignty and the fragility of the status of sovereign power, I think, further catalyzes these rather pathological inheritances and the impositions on minority groups, such as the Shia, such as the Ahmadis, and so on. That would be my sort of very cursory reading of what happens. But to just end this answer on the note on which I end the book as well, my postscript, that in 2016, when I was researching this book and I was looking for a copy of Hifzul Iman by Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi at Anarkali in Lahore Bazaar. So this bookseller, when I asked for Hifzul Iman, was being very, very shy and being very, very discreet about giving me a copy. And when I asked why, he said, these days there is this anti-terrorism laws that you should not sell any books which are seen as too hostile or too sectarian, is the word that he used. जो फ़िरक़ावारियत को फ़रोग़ देते हों. And apparently someone had entered this text also in that list. Now, the authorities which were making these lists about, polemical texts or polemics should not be debated and discussed in the public sphere. So the people who were deciding on these texts were, of course, the modernist elite who had not much knowledge of this whole tradition. So there were these funny, narratives that Punjab police was going door to door, asking people, Shibli Nomani kithe honda hai, thinking as if he's some kind of a living figure. And the underlying assumption there by the state is that, sometimes it would ignite polemical passions for its purposes. Other times it would play the modernist game of trying to completely erase or douse any kind of polemical energy from the public sphere. That when you try to hide and when you try to blanket and when you try to ban things as a way to, remove quote-unquote sectarian tensions, that in some ways gives rise to even more volatile and even more pernicious and less intellectually sophisticated varieties of those debates and those disagreements. That the way to deal with this is not to completely brush it aside as irrelevant and these squabbles of these ulama who did not have better things to do in the 19th century, or to completely ban it as saying no polemics, we won't discuss any kind of hostile things, but rather to engage in this kind of intellectually dense and difficult examination of this heritage. Without that, I think these kinds of debates will just remain hidden from the public sphere or will manifest in very pernicious and violent ways. So in some ways, the politics behind the book is to present an invitation to take a look at this heritage on its own terms without romanticizing it, without glorifying it, and without completely vilifying it or erasing it or banning it either. So that in some ways gives me a good opportunity to state that. Thank you.
I mean, I think that the fragility of the self is an important issue, and it is somewhat, ironic at the time when there really is absolutely no threat to Islam in the public sphere in Pakistan. Regardless of what you think Pakistan is, regardless of what you think Islam is, you'll find its manifestation in the public sphere. So at that time when there's just no threat to that, you have the most extreme kind of intolerance of any different contested kind of notion of what that Islam is. And that strikes me as being very bizarre, but I think it's part of a wider political malaise. I mean, there is no political tolerance in Pakistan as well. We can see that it's basically a context which is deeply fragile, deeply fragmented, and deeply problematic as well.
Right.
But anyway, we're not really here to talk about that particular political issue. But I think that's part of that wider symptom of what happens when we're talking about the contestation of Islam. Can I just link one further thing? Because we're talking about sovereignty, and it strikes me that just in the way that the post-47 nation state has debated what Islam means in Pakistan and what authority does Islam have constitutionally and so forth. In some ways, this is very similar to 18th, 19th century conceptions of the authority of the Prophet and, of course, in a Shia context, the authority of the Imams, directly related to conceptions of kingship. So if I give you a parallel kind of debate which is going on, which remains a very major issue in, this sort of problematic binary between tradition and reform in contemporary Shia Islam. From the early part of the 18th century, the late part of the 18th century, you have a number of works which are written on statecraft, on notions around kingship. And they always begin with a discussion of what do we mean by velayat or wilaya. And that is, of course, what is the scope of the authority and the sovereignty of the Prophet and the Imams? And so you can have a maximalist position on it and you can have a minimalist position on it. And that seems to be connected to what you think the delegated authority of the king is. And then the whole idea of a hierarchy which develops from that. And so it seems that certainly as you move along, it of course breaks up. It's not such a neat thing to say that those who are opposed to absolute authority of the king are also opposed to the absolute authority of the imam. But in some cases, there are certain types of continuities. When you look at works written by Sufis and anti-Sufis at the end of the 19th century in Iran, and certainly in the early 20th century. And you find some of these sorts of debates about, velayat and kingship and authority also emerging in a South Asian Shia context. And the two obvious people I can think of are Seher Ali Rizvi writing in Lahore in the early part of the 20th century, and Naqan Saab, Seher Ali Naqvi writing in Lucknow in the early part of the 20th century. Both contexts which are deeply colonial, right? Where the issue of sovereignty is then directly associated with the sovereignty of the Prophet and the Imam. So what I'm doing in a sense is I'm giving you a further context, a wider context, which seems to be peculiar to this period from about 1800 onwards in the Islamic East.
Absolutely, and I think implicit in your comment and question is also very important, and I think productive critique that these intra-Muslim debates or study of Muslim intellectual discourses, how enriched they would be if one takes a purview, a purview which is a conceptual purview, which is expansive, and I would be the first to admit that it's problematic, as you know better than anyone else, to limit one's discursive arena to Sunni Muslim scholars alone. I think that, of course, is a majoritarian bias in Euro-American, at least, studies on Islam, and in some way, this book also participates in it. And the reason for that really is the way in which graduate studies is structured in many ways, where many of the programs, of course, are focused on Sunni Islam and this kind of expectation to not dabble in things that might be a bit beyond one's quote unquote expertise is certainly there. But I think your comment really shows an expansive purview which takes into account, especially Shia discourses and debates, how productive and helpful that would be. So that is a very important critique. On this question of sovereignty, you're absolutely right. I think this is the key question, where you have this very fascinating syncopation or ways in which there is a reflection of emerging notions of sovereignty in the political sphere, informing new notions of sovereignty and how sovereignty gets debated in the theological realm. And my interest primarily coming at this category of political theology was that the category of political theology in Euro-American, studies on religion, politics, etc., especially in the wake of this appropriation and in some ways the new kind of ways in which Carl Schmitt has been appropriated and read in the last 3 decades or so in the Euro-American Academy. The main preoccupation of that field of political theology has been to really show the theological underpinnings of the modern secular state, and to show that, as Carl Schmitt famously had argued, that all famous and well-known categories of modern politics are in some ways secularized theological categories, most notably the category of the exception, which is the miracle in the theological realm and the exception of the state to announce the emergency in the political realm, through which you really try to complicate this supposed rupture between modern secular state sovereignty and a pre-modern, monarchical, theologically infused notion of sovereignty. What I tried to do, this really was a theoretical experiment, was to invert this problem space and this kind of a line of questioning by looking not so much at the theological underpinnings of the modern state, but rather looking at the political theories embedded and implicit in seemingly theological disputes and debates. So, on this question of shafa'a or intercession, or on these other questions of divine sovereignty, what are the political assumptions and desires at work when someone like Fazl Khairabadi, when he's trying to argue in support of intercession and in support of a hierarchical notion of a spiritual hierarchy that has clearly identified hierarchies of the Prophet, God, saints, common people, and so on. What kinds of language does he employ in presenting that argument? And that language, in some ways, is very much infused in the language of both a monarchical vision of Mughal sovereignty and also the kind of hierarchical vision that came about with the emergence of British colonial sovereignty. Whereas for Shah Muhammad Ismail, there is this kind of a notion of politics which is much more horizontal, which is much more critical of hierarchies, which is taking on this kind of new modern consciousness, increasingly critical of the exception, increasingly critical of hierarchies. So I really wanted to examine and suggest some of these syncopations or some of these mutual imbrications of the political notions of sovereignty emerging at this moment of crisis and unclarity, and what happens in the theological realm, to not make a cause and effect argument. Again, it's not a cause and effect argument that one causes the other, but how the two, in fact, are so mutually entangled that one cannot separate the one from the other, theology and politics. And that, for me, is what the category of political theology allows me to do in relation to my main argument of describing this intra-Muslim debate as one between competing political theologies.
I think that's, I mean, I can think of many examples precisely of that, particularly in the first half of the 20th century in India. I mean, take one example, someone I looked at recently, again with Nakhan Saab. You know, he has this, one of his longer kind of works is a work called La Tufsidu fil Ard, which is basically a Quranic defense of Satyagraha. You know, the Gandhian notion of Satyagraha as the sort of, you know, truth force notion of non-violence.
Right.
And it's very, I mean, he doesn't mention Gandhi at all, but it's very, very obvious that that's in many ways the origins of this particular text as it was written in the late 1930s. So I think there are lots of other examples where, you know, theological works which are coming out are very much at least motivated by certain kinds of developments in the political sphere.
Right.
You know, why does a certain notion of, you know, what you might call enlightenment sensibility around rationality, why does that become translated into theological forms of modernism? I mean, I think that does have, I think that does give us at least some evidence for the sort of political foundation of some of those debates that are going on.
Absolutely.
Certainly in the 20th century, yeah.
Absolutely. And very briefly to respond there, I think the challenge then becomes, how does one account for these political conditions, transformations, without reducing religious thought either to those conditions, to not just make a materialist argument about there are some kind of materialist political conditions to which these debates or these discourses can in fact be reduced to, but rather these are part of, you know, long-running intra-Muslim traditions of discourse and debate that predate you know, the colonial period. So to be attentive to that long-running character of these discourses as well, but then to also connect these discourses, debates, and texts to these emerging political transformations without reducing that discourse to those conditions either. So that, I think, is a conceptual methodological problem and challenge, which is a useful one to negotiate.
Seher, do you have anything further?
I think I'd like to check with Fatma at this point if there's audience questions. Fatma, would you like to open it up to taking questions from the audience? Are you here?
Hi, yes. Am I audible? Hello, am I audible?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So we do not have any questions as of yet. We have a lot of praise for the book. People are commenting that it's a wonderful book. So if you guys would have like some closing remarks, we can maybe do that and then finish off the session.
Can I actually ask one last question? Shirley, you mentioned earlier that your work was actually being translated into Urdu. So it's a very simple terminological issue, or maybe not simple. How do you render terms like sovereignty and political theology in ways in which can communicate what you're trying to say in Urdu?
No, that's an excellent question. And what makes it complicated is that, a category like sovereignty. Sovereignty, and something I had to clarify in my second book when this question really came about, quite rightly so. I had consigned it to an endnote, and it was a good lesson that these key categories you have to put in the main text. Does not correspond to any one category in Arabic, Persian, or Urdu here. There is a family of concepts from Qudrat-e-Ilahi to there is a footnote, an endnote there that I should have looked before this conversation, but a number of other concepts of Hakimiyya and Qudrat-e-Ilahi and so on. There are 5 or 6 different concepts that converge on this notion of sovereignty as the capacity to announce and enact the exception. So the challenge again is that this category is informed by a family of different categories, primarily Arabic in origin, which take different forms in Persian and Urdu, and how to render that back into Urdu with a single category. Of course, it's difficult. I think it would require. I have given my translator his name is Muhammad Jan Akhundzada, a really promising young scholar from Char Sadda, who is almost done with the translation. So I'll take a look at it once he's done. But I think one has to present a footnote there to just explain that this category can be translated multiple ways, and you have to make a choice as a translator in a way that would be least foreign to its audience. Is what I would say, and this, of course, is a challenge that we also face in terms of translating, these Islamicate languages into English. So that's what I would say. Political theology, of course, is a classic notion. It's not really political theology is one of those most slippery concepts. It's not really the relationship between theology and politics per se. It's more to do with the kind of entanglement of theological discourses and political conditions and debates in a particular historical moment. How do you render that? Do you call it siyasi ilahiyat? Do you call it ilahiyat siyasi? Multiple options are there. So I think you just have to make a choice, defend it, and explain it in a footnote. That has to be the kind of operation that I think would make more sense. But it's a challenge. I'm not envious of this task. I'm translating any text really, but this one especially, because it's not only engaging in these Muslim scholarly discourses, but also multiple threads of Western humanities, which have their own genealogies, have their own kind of traditions. To render that into Urdu in a way that would be understandable and also approachable, I think is a difficult ask. So I really want to appreciate Mohammad Jan as well. But yeah, so you were saying something.
No, I was just going to say that because this issue is really fraught when you look at Arabic and Persian translations, for example, of Schmidt. So there's no agreement actually in how you translate the term. Right. So ilahiyat siyasi, lahut siyasi. I mean, there's and it's very problematic. And when it comes to a term like sovereignty, the problem is if you use a term like hakimiyat has a lot of baggage, which you don't really want to be indicating by using hakimiyat. And even words like siyadat also have certain baggage of their own. So at times it's a difficult one, because you think, well, what terms come out of the tradition? And what you realize is quite often within the text of the different traditions, they don't necessarily refer to this directly.
Right.
And so there isn't really a 19th century term for this at all.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a great challenge, and it would be actually interesting in the future to have this particular conversation in Urdu on the Urdu translation, and I think that would probably go in slightly different directions, which would be quite good fun. Yeah, absolutely. Something to think about.
Absolutely. So, Fatma, should we close it, or any questions from the audience? They have typed or something, as you wish.
Hi.
I don't want.
So yeah, no questions as of yet.
Okay.
I do think people are still, so we do
Okay.
have like a lot of praises for the book. I would, yeah, maybe go through the comments. Um, and I think that should be it. I would want to thank Dr. Sher Ali again for joining us, and Dr. Sajjad and Dr. Seher as well, for such an insightful session. I personally learned a lot from it, being a student right now. So I think I'm definitely gonna get my hands on the book and give it a read, and hopefully I think this was a wonderful session overall. So yeah, that's it.
Now, I just want to take a moment, Fatma, to thank you for organizing this, to Folio Books again, Bilal Zahoor, for taking on this book. And really, really, my extensive thanks to Seher and Sajjad. This perhaps has been the most substantive discussion on the book that I've had in the 3.5 years since it's been published. So this was a true honor and a tremendous conversation. And I really, really want to thank them for their time on such short notice to engage with the book and to ask such probing and exciting and important questions. So thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you all.